Welcome to Cultural Economy in the Kitchen, the podcast from the Journal of Cultural Economy's editorial collective. I'm Dr. Addie McGowan, a research associate in market studies at the University of Salford's Business School. And I'm also reviews and online content editor for the JCE.
And I'm Professor Philip Roscoe, Professor of Management at the University of St Andrews Business School, and I'm Co-Editor-in-Chief of the JCE.
Today is all about music and money, two things we love. We'll discuss two quite different but complementary papers that analyze how shifting economic structures in the biz fundamentally reshape the creation, value, and distribution of music. Interesting stuff.
Let's introduce our guests, Dr. Paul Rekret and Dr. Elizabeth Carter. Betsy, can you please introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining from?
Yeah, hello. So I'm joining you guys from the University of New Hampshire in Durham, New Hampshire. Here I'm an associate now. Sorry, I've been tenured. Yay! Associate professor of political science. And I focus on cultural markets. So my dissertation, that work was actually on the wine economy. And now I'm looking at music. Both very complicated. I think I must be some kind of masochist. But fun topics.
But yeah, fun topics, as you say, both also extremely nice. And congratulations on the tenure. That's absolutely fantastic. And maybe we should just stop there and just enjoy the moment. Betsy, what have you been cooking lately?
So I've actually been trying to perfect the shrimp taco. Last night's was less successful iteration, but I'm doing different cremas, different kind of vegetable variation, different marinades. And, it's one of those things that like the first one was really great. So you want to keep trying to recreate it and perfect it. But, it's an art like maybe academia sometimes, right? More than
that is always the way, isn't it? When you cook something once and it's fantastic and it's never as good again, you live your life in this state of underachievement. Yeah.
100%.
Right, exactly. All right. So, Paul, can you please introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining us from today?
Yeah. So, hi, I'm based at the Communication and Media Research Institute at the University of Westminster, where I also teach in the School of Media and Communication. And I'm joining you from home in East London today.
Nice. And what are you cooking in your home in East London lately?
Well, we're just getting through the end of the winter crop in the garden at the moment. So a lot of kale, cavolo nero, spinach, chard, just coming to the end of that. And I think we're a few days away from wild garlic season. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Good season here in the UK.
You plainly don't live in East Scotland. That's all I can say to wild garlic. So that's our lineup for today. And if you think it sounds good, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons. Now let's get started.
All right. Thanks, Philip. So, Paul, your paper, Sensuous Abstraction, Hip Hop, Money, and the Popular. It's hot off the press from our first issue in 2026. I really loved the paper, and especially your deep appreciation for and knowledge of the genre came through in a big way. So I had to put on the albums you focus on from Bad Boy Records, which are Notorious B.I.G.'s Life After Death, Puff Daddy, and The Family's No Way Out, and Mace's Harlem World, as I was prepping for this episode. So I really got into it. I was struck by the staying power of their hits. I kind of forgot what songs were on each of the albums and was freshly reminded of all the samples and collaboration between artists on each of them. Like my own, I'm from Memphis, Tennessee, so my hometown, Memphis 8-Ball and MJG were really appreciated.
As I said, this podcast is very revealing about many of the contributors, including your own colleagues. I never would have pegged the professional Addie McGowan as a hip-hop aficionado, but here we are.
Yeah, I grew up in Memphis. I have to be. So your paper traces the conditions for the rise of hip-hop to the top of pop music charts and focuses on how Notorious B.I.G., Puff Daddy, at that time called Puff Daddy, and Mace, quote, codify wealth and money as a sensuous abstraction. So can you kick us off a little bit by telling us what your hook was into this paper? Why were you interested in this, and why did you want to explore this in research?
Yeah, thanks very much. It started with a conversation with some friends sitting around one evening, as one does, listening to some music. And I think one of those Puff Daddy songs came on maybe the radio or somebody's Spotify stream. And the question that we asked was simply, what made this work? I mean, superficially, these are sort of widely derided, especially Puff Daddy's work, as being quite sort of shallow, cynical, commercial, taking samples or hooks from well-known pop songs, Diana Ross, Kool and the Gang, and so on, only changing them very minimally, or at least superficially, it seems like they're only altered very minimally. And yet they became absolutely massive hits. And as I argue in the paper, marked a crucial turning point for hip hop's popularity, not only in, say, US and UK markets, but was really a turning point for, I think that subgenre is more or less, dominance over popular music charts, which I think sort of occurs over the next couple decades from that moment in 1997 to the point where it's the most streamed genre or subgenre of pop music globally today. So the question was just why and how is that possible, and something that sort of culturally is overlooked, not seen as a sort of important or crucial moment generally. So yeah, it was just a curiosity that sort of started from there.
Yeah. So from that curiosity, can you introduce your main argument of this paper and expand upon it just a little bit?
Sure. Now let me see if I can do this, because the argument sort of goes in a number of directions at once.
Sure.
I guess the central claim is that what these albums are doing at a very specific historical moment is able to, I think, as is sort of referred to in the quote that you pulled from the paper, is codify, aestheticize the experience of money in a very specific way that speaks to a number of things that are happening at that moment and continue to happen up through to the present. So that means both a sort of experience of what we could broadly call neoliberalism, post-Fordism, financialization, sort of pick your favorite periodization, right, or way of sort of framing this. On the one hand, so you could say that these albums are effectively doing sort of ideological work in laying the cultural ground for individualization of risk, a sort of mass entrance into asset economies, into finance, whether that's through pensions, home ownership, et cetera, which is all being extended in the US in the years running up to those albums. But I think they're also doing other things that are more interesting. So on the one hand, they aestheticize or give us an experience of those processes in a way that I think few artists have done historically, for better or for worse. So when I use that phrase sensuous abstraction in the title, what I'm referring to is the fact that on the one hand, money is an abstraction. Indeed, capitalism, one way of thinking about what capitalism is a social and economic system where we're ruled by abstractions, money, commodity, property, etc., that generally we don't have sort of close, tangible experience of in the way that we would have in previous economic systems. Lordship, say, for example. So they're giving us an aesthetic, tangible, sensuous experience of those processes. They're able to aestheticize them. And they do so in quite complicated ways that I think speak to, on the one hand, the demand to identify with those processes of financialization or the extension of financialized processes into everyday life. On the other hand, I think they're also not so neatly sort of reflective of hegemony in that sense, that they're also doing more complicated things and expressing tensions that are happening culturally, but also more widely in those processes.
So take us into a little more detail, perhaps. I mean, while you're talking, I'm thinking of my own field, which is the sociology of finance, and I'm interested, or at least I've read very widely in the cultural economy of finance, and this notion of 1980s financial print culture, where finance is portrayed as elite and male masculinized, all of these kind of things by writers like Tom Wolfe and subsequently Michael Lewis and so forth. So this is different. This is about how individuals, record buying individuals perhaps, are experiencing these big economic transformations that you're talking about in the recording industry. So take us back a little bit more to the 1990s, which I'm assured are very, very of the moment. Again, we've just spent a long discussion about whether academic 90s brackets are back in or back out, you know the things I mean. What's going on in the city, what's going on with race, with culture, all of these kind of things that we can reflect on.
Sure. So I mean, the way I articulate this context is a series of processes that are happening at different sort of temporal but also spatial scales, right? So on the one hand, we can start with the recording industry, which is flush with cheap cash. Mergers and acquisitions are rife. So I think, and Betsy will probably remember this better than I do, but I think at that point, we're talking about an oligopoly of the 5 record labels. Now, I think we're down to 3 still at the moment. Music industry retail is being transformed by big box stores, for instance, which is both conditional of and reflective of a sort of narrowing into a kind of blockbuster model where, those retailers are able to undercut conventional music retail on price, but their selection is pretty narrow and limited. So, there's I think probably a greater concentration of sales in the top 40 than there would have been previously. One of the claims I make, drawing on some of the sociology of music literature, is all of that sort of M&A activity, merger and acquisition activity, back catalogues being sold, publishing rights being moved around, even chopped up a little bit by that point, and sold, gives artists a better sense of their own value as a commodity. Black music is a little bit unique because Black artists, but also managers, executives, are mainly excluded from the sort of centers of power in the industry. So there's a quite rich and burgeoning independent music scene, especially in hip hop. Hip hop records occasionally appear in the top 40. They're exceptions rather than the rule. More broadly, in New York, the home of hip hop music, at least initially, and still considered the home of hip hop music at that point in the mid-1990s, is also rapidly being transformed. Rudy Giuliani has become the mayor, effectively a reorganization of the economy of New York around finance, service industry, tourism, involves in part a sort of quite aggressive, indeed often violent, gentrification of formerly working class inner city boroughs like Brooklyn, Harlem, and so on. So the places where hip hop music is being made are being transformed. And I would nest all of those within wider Clinton era economic transformations. I mentioned sort of extension of home ownership, cheap credit, et cetera, wider changes to the experience of work that obviously don't start in the mid 1990s, but I think are nonetheless sort of marking an important turning point, I think, or at least a significant one around that period.
Yeah, right. And Betsy, you were nodding away. Is there anything you want to jump in?
Yes, I was
there?
actually just, writing notes of things. First of all, I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed your article, and it was really thought-provoking and really enjoyable to read. There are kind of two things. I had like my question that I was thinking about upon reading your article before this, and then a new question. So I'm going to try to combine those. I'm really interested in the relationship between music and place, and kind of how there are ideas, right, about here, about the playa, for example. Like, that seems to me to be maybe a New York thing. I'm a West Coast girl, born in Seattle, lived in California for a long time, and so thinking about the West Coast rap, and thinking about gangsta, right, and wondering what kind of conversation was going on back and forth, or was there not? Is it that, New York being the financial center, that it resonated especially there? I think that there would have to be some kind of an impact on images and ideas in West Coast rap. So that's kind of one question. And related is how ideas of masculinity are evolving and changing in this context. I think of hip hop, I think of really strong alpha males, and how is this idea of masculinity evolving with the concepts that you discuss in your article?
Yeah, thanks. Those are great questions. I think, well, first of all, broadly, hip hop music has an especially intense relationship to place, signifiers of very, very specific it's unique for having those very, very specific signifiers of place down to street corners and things, as markers of authenticity that most of the audience wouldn't recognize, wouldn't know, but are absolutely crucial. And there's a range of debates in popular music studies for what exactly that's doing, right? The second sort of big kind of thematic thing I'd gesture at in terms of the relationship of music and place here is that hip hop, in terms of subgenres of popular music more broadly, is significant for the fact that the music is, I'm charting a moment in which the music is circulating increasingly rapidly and increasingly widely on a global scale. But of course, the communities out of which that music emerges are intensely policed, segregated, one might even say sort of subject to forms of informal apartheid, right? So I think, there's a way in which the commodity can circulate in a way that that the artist cannot, right? So I think those are just two things I'd start with. But then to say that I think this moment in 1997 that I'm charting, the emergence of, the playa, the Big Willie, there's all sort of names that people referred to this increasing sort of commercialization of hip hop, identification with the commodity, I suppose, by the artist, marks an important transformation with the history of hip hop. And the contrast with gangster rap and with Los Angeles in particular is an interesting one, because gangster rap already marks a moment critics would often refer to as a kind of neoliberal period in rap music. So on the one hand, what you move from is a quite aggressive, counter-hegemonic, oppositional music initially in the 1980s to, by the time of the early 1990s with artists like Snoop Dogg or Dr. Dre, you get much more of an accommodation with the dominant social order. So sonically, the music becomes much smoother, mainly premised on jazz and soul samples. It's still deeply, intensely patriarchal, often sort of themes of violence. It's still a sort of first-person accounting, a sort of mythologizing, I suppose, or phantasmagoric first-person account of daily life for a racialized underclass. But it's also the freedom of movement in one's Cadillac around the city, for instance, which is a sort of pervasive theme in West Coast gangster rap in the early 1990s, right? So, something of an accommodation, something of a transformation from that music's early moments in the late 1970s and 1980s in New York. And I think that what happens with this moment in the late 1990s is a bit of a transformation because on the one hand, the identity as a criminalized underclass shifts, and I think this is really important. It shifts in the way artists discuss it to still being first person, still being sort of, tales of criminality and the consumption of Black criminality in particular, and that kind of voyeurism is still quite definitive of sort of the way in which I think the dominant culture is consuming hip hop, but it's set for the artist in the past, right? It's a marker of authenticity, but it's also a story about this is what I once did, but now I don't need to work and I can identify with money itself. I am money. I don't need to work. I don't need to do anything, but I once, it's a sort of bootstrapping logic, but also one that works slightly differently than the West Coast rap. Sonically, it's continuous to a degree, but rather than sort of 60s and 70s sort of obscure funk and soul samples, it's mainly sampling from top 40 hits itself, Diana Ross, Kool and the Gang, and so on. It also adopts a slightly different sort of pose of masculinity, to come to your second question, much more focused on consumption. And I think, as I say in the paper, kind of previously, generally activities of shopping, consumption, dress that were generally feminized become masculinized in this instance. And still, I would add, intensely misogynistic, patriarchal. Although even there, I think the terrain isn't smooth and it's contested, and the meanings of discussions of sex, of bodies, and so on isn't articulated simply in one form. There's a lot of debate in the literature about how exactly those discussions of sex, bodily pleasure, and so on should be consumed. But I think in the main, I would say that sort of placing one's life as a gangster, as a sort of criminal underclass lumpen proletariat in the past rather in the present, marks a crucial shift.
Yeah, I love how you put it, and I quote, "The inner city ghetto is abandoned, but not for any particular place. Instead, global mobility itself becomes the central figure of hip hop's new geography." So I feel like you just spoke to that from a cultural signifying standpoint and also a geographical standpoint, which kind of it's all making that shift. Which I think brings us to, and you mentioned the sensuous, sensuality, I guess, of this, but your central notion of sensuous abstraction. So can you just kind of describe the concept a bit further for us, and what work it has done introducing this has done to help you really understand what's going on?
Yeah. What I think is so interesting about these artists and this music at this specific moment is precisely that, the way in which they're aestheticizing money and wealth. They're usually read as simply in terms of kind of symptomatic reading, or viewed as pathological in effect, right? Sort of neoliberal culture dominates everything, and you get this sort of commercial excess that defines popular culture. I think that gets at part of it. I think other readings that are that view this work as much more transformative, right? So in the sense that taking luxury goods, gold in particular, and aestheticizing it, valuing it for its aesthetic qualities rather than simply for its value, its economic or financial value, marks an important sort of aesthetic gesture, especially for racialized people and especially for Black artists, where we're talking about artists who are generally excluded from the frame of dominant culture visually in particular. What I think is happening is actually something more complicated, and this is that idea of sensuous abstraction, something that's much more in tension with the dominant culture. If we think about money as a force of abstraction or as a process of abstraction, right, that by definition quantifies the qualitative in order to make things exchangeable. And that, again, is what I was saying earlier about the sort of abstract nature of a life in a capitalist society itself. Then what these artists are doing is in very subtle, sonic, visual, lyrical fashion, again, making those processes tangible, eticizing them, making them the object of whether implicit or explicit, very rarely explicit, but cultural reflection, discussion, and debate. And I think that's a rare moment in popular culture, a thing that happens quite rarely in popular culture and marks an important turning point, I think, more broadly.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add too, not only also the sampling practices, which that really struck me as just a really, I know it's a small point that you make, but I think it's a fantastic one. So, as Mace put it, hits from the 80s, like Sting and the Police, like Every Breath You Take, for example, it's the literal embedding of luxury and kind of those other, beyond the cultural assumptions of maybe where these artists lie, into the recordings themselves, as you put it, a sonic luxury. And I've been thinking with that a lot. So thank you for that. Okay, I could talk about this all day, but I think it's time to move on to Betsy's paper. So yeah, Philip, take it away.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, we're talking about riches, and now we're going to be talking about poverty. And Betsy's title is a very nice bridge between the two. The paper is Elizabeth Carter, Poverty Among Riches, Understanding the Contracted Economy for Recorded Music and Its Impact on Market Actors. And it's a completely different take on music economies in contemporary late capitalism. It's a time when the glamour seems to have gone out of everything and we're all just plain broke. And the paper sets out, nodding away. The paper sets out to investigate the conundrum that music is everywhere, and everybody's always plugged in, everybody's always listening all the time, and yet musicians are struggling to make a living. A friend of mine who's a middle-aged guy with a habit of buying band T-shirts, which is something I have sartorial views on. But anyway, he says it's a risky business, printed T-shirts when you're a gentleman of my vintage. He says he likes to go to gigs because he goes to the merchandise stall and he buys the merchandise, and the band members are selling it because they can't make money on the recordings, they can't make money on the gig, they can't make money on selling anything else, so they get themselves onto the merchandise stand and flog the T-shirts to turn a profit. So anyway, I mean, you give us this comprehensive account of rent seeking and asset owning in the platform economy. But interestingly, in your piece, the platforms aren't the villains, and we'll get to that in a minute. But tell us how you became interested in the topic, first of all, and how you approached it.
Well, I imagine that, like Paul, I'm a music lover. And I've always thought, because I do political economy, I've always been interested in these ideas. And especially I do political economy because I'm interested in equity. I'll also add I was and am a major Prince fan, right? And you guys may remember that Prince, put Slave on his cheek. So I was always aware that there are tensions. And also, George Michael also sued Sony. And aware that there were tensions between artists and labels. But I was living abroad, living in Europe. And I remember following Taylor Swift's, she's had many battles, very successful, actually. She's really positively changed the market for musicians on a few different fronts when it comes to the outcome of her battles with labels. But I was like, okay, why? It makes sense to me why in the 1980s labels might have an upper hand, right? You have to pay a lot of money to record an album, right? You have to press it, distribute it, bring it to Tower Records or Warehouse or Target or wherever. Why is it, when an artist can record themselves, upload it to YouTube, they can make a great song in their own home? The cost of production and distribution have plummeted, but yet this power imbalance is still there. So I initially, I started digging into this, and As I was digging, it was 2019 that I started this project. 2020 hits, artists start organizing in things such as Justice for Spotify. And I'm like, okay, so it must be the labels and Spotify. When I published the article in 2023, there was a lot you have to learn, as Paul probably knows, right, about how the music industry works. Like, even if I'm just writing up here, I wanted to know about how all of the contracts worked and everything underneath it. So 2023, I published this. Spotify, at that point, still had not turned an annual profit. Meanwhile, we now have 3 major labels are having record profits, and the average musician is earning $12 a month, right? So this idea that they're getting their income from merch is exactly right. Like, it used to be, that you would release a record. If you think about the relationship between the record and the touring, you would tour in the past so people would know your music and they'd buy your record because that's where you would make money. That is now the opposite, right? You want to have music streaming so that you can go on tour. But yeah, even, you aren't going to make that much money with the tour unless you're really big. So then you're also going to be doing merchandises where they have sometimes, really good margins, unless you have a 360 deal, which are luckily decreasingly common. But with a 360 deal, your record label takes a cut of your touring revenue and takes a cut of your merch. I also have a data point I have in the paper that I actually got from the labels themselves, this estimate, that the average musician, if you have a regular contract with a major label, you will need more than 453 million streams before you have any profit margin. And that has to do, and that's something I don't talk about too much in the paper. What I focus on the paper is why the music economy is contracted. Back in the day, I loved music. I have my CD towers, and each CD would be, $16.99 or more. Now we have a lot of music for very cheap. It's actually great for consumers. It's good for labels. It's really, really bad for musicians. So I talk about the structure of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's dig in. I mean, I guess your kind of starting off point for your analysis is that digital music is a non-rivalrous good. So what do you mean by that, and why does that matter?
Yeah. So the structure of the market has fundamentally changed, right? So it used to be, and this actually happened to me. And when Paul was speaking, I was thinking about MC Hammer and like his early 90s aesthetic. And I remember going to buy
his trousers
Hammer.
Back. I need to know if the 90s are in, Hammer's trousers back.
But I can remember going to Fred Meyer, which was the store in Seattle, to buy Please Hammer, Don't Hurt Him, because I was a fan. And it was sold out. I couldn't buy it, right? So it used to be in the day that it would actually be, you'd have a physical item, there would be a certain number, and if, the 3 of you bought the record, I might not be able to. Well, it's not that way with streaming, right? No matter, you guys might stream, I don't want to say P. Diddy for obvious reasons. Is it Mausa? Did I say that right? So maybe, if you are all listening to him.
You're right. We might, Betsy.
I can listen to him too, right? Your consumption of him in no way affects my ability to consume. So it's not like other goods that have this marginal pricing, right? So it doesn't work like a regular market. You actually pay instead for access to this, for access to the product. So it's kind of like, well, what do we charge for it then? And so I say that the problem, so we can't have marginal pricing, but, so it can't work say, if you think of like Airbnb or Uber, where you actually, there's like a person and they're like, okay, is that marginal price? Do I want to take it? It's more like video streaming, right? So I buy Netflix or I pay for a Netflix subscription. Honestly, sometimes I don't watch anything. But if I watch a lot of things or zero, it's the same price. But the difference between music and video is that, there's Netflix, there's Apple, there's Amazon, and they have different products. So you might be subscribed, the average person is actually subscribed simultaneously to 3 different video service providers or digital service providers who are videos. So you have a pretty big pie. And actually, despite it was inconvenient that everyone went on strike in Hollywood when I was writing this, because what I was seeing was actually that the industry was employing more people and that there was less economic inequality. There was more money to go around. Well, in music, you have these 3 labels that own, about 80%, 70-some% of all catalog. It's kind of the history of recorded music. And every single, if you're, Apple Music or your Amazon Music or your Spotify, you have access to the same catalog. So there's not much product differentiation. So if Spotify increases their price suddenly, be like, well, I'm just going to switch the product, right? It's like if Coke and Pepsi were exactly the same thing. So prices are low. And another thing that keeps prices low is that actually the industry is still really, really fearful of streaming. And they have a lot of power in the industry, but they're not pushing for higher prices because they're scared of something like Napster happening again. So so the whole type of the market is unique because it's non-rival, non-excludable. That's not necessarily a problem, but the way that the rest of the market is structured with interchangeable goods makes it like this contracted economy that I talk about.
So where, for example, Netflix have their own studio, so if you want to watch Netflix, if you want to watch Netflix films, you have to have Netflix, or if you want to watch certain footballing or sporting events or whatever, you have to have certain channels, and so that the scarcity of those kind of things introduces some ability for the platforms to protect their prices. But in the case of Spotify, you compare them. I mean, Spotify are up against Amazon and Apple, for example, selling the same stuff.
Exactly right. And, there's also an incentive if you think about like Netflix, HBO Max, and they want to get new subscribers. So they want to have the newest show. They want to have great content, right? There's a competitive dynamic that doesn't exist in music. Like increasingly every year, more and more people are listening to back catalog. Right? Back catalog is music that's more than 18 months old. And actually, there's even like 50% of the music we listen to today is more than 5 years old, right? And part of this too, I actually think it's, kind of the algorithm that people like what they know. The algorithm's going to feed back to familiar music. And there just isn't this competition and innovation that we might see driving the labels. Right, as you see driving the studios.
You're muted.
Yeah,
Eddie.
we're seeing that. I know. Yeah, we are. Sorry, the dog was barking, so I did
Sorry,
decide
Charles.
to mute for a minute. Sorry, Charles. Yeah, I mean, we've seen that with with our podcast. We're on these different channels and we're just reproducing it in different ways, and it's just kind of given us a tiny, tiny little bit of perspective into where we're streamed and who's listening and how fragmented that is. But it's the same. So collecting data and managing playlists, it has become kind of the thing. And so how can a standalone service you mentioned like Spotify ever reach profitability or pay artists more when they're up against, the likes of Apple and Amazon, their deep pockets? What's your thought there?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things going on. So Spotify, So one issue obviously is that they're competing against other, their competitors can lose money on music and can use music as a price loss leader to bring other people into, say, the Amazon universe, right? I have my Echo Dot, right? It's really convenient to ask Alexa to play music, right? They're always trying to get me to sign up for Amazon Prime, right? And they can actually give that to you, for free or and same with Apple, right? They have this universe that they want to integrate you into, and they can afford to lose money on it. So Spotify, again, is trying to compete in that type of market environment. The other thing, though, that I think is actually just as problematic or more problematic, again, is the power of the record labels, and that Spotify has to pay for each. It was easier when they were at $9.99 because I could talk about like a $10 pie. Let's just go back to those days of like 2022 when it was $9.99. Spotify would get $3 for every $10 that you spend. And the rest would go to rights holders. So, and so as I mentioned, Spotify is profitable now. And part of the reason Spotify wasn't profitable in like 2022, 2023 is they were trying to have a differentiated product. They wanted to be the only one that had, for example, cultural economy in the kitchen. They were paying a lot of money for specific podcasts because they were like, maybe then people will subscribe to us. We can have something different that we bring. Tidal tried to do this with a higher quality, but most people are not that sensitive to the differences with the music audio podcast. So the idea is that Spotify has moved away from that. But it's quite structural. Yeah.
Yeah. I have to say, I've stood outside the garage entrance in the Spotify offices in Stockholm and at kicking out time, because it's bang in the centre near the hotel that I've ended up staying at. And I have to say that suggests that even despite profitability, times are not too hard in Spotify. The shiny metal coming out. Paul, would you like to come in? Is this ringing bells?
Yeah, thank you. No, I've been dying to ask something, so I'm glad.
Please do.
You asked me, and it was a brilliant paper, and it was one of those papers that that everything after I read it seemed completely self-evident, as if I already knew it all, but only after reading the paper, and that was a sort of lovely elegance of it. But I wonder if you could sort of unpack a bit more of why platforms like Spotify just have failed besides the podcasting sector to move up the value chain a bit more. Is it that the licensing deals that they have with the labels don't allow that, and because the labels have such a concentration of power? Is it
Okay.
If we compare them with Netflix, that's exactly what Netflix did, right? They start as a distributor and then gradually move up the value chain and then move into new markets, Korea, et cetera. And Spotify haven't done that at all, right?
Yeah. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated because of the really high reliance on non-disclosure agreements between like Spotify or any digital service provider and the labels. However, there were press releases in around like 2019 about how Spotify was starting to sign their own artists. Right. So they were trying to move up the value chain, and they did. And then that went away. And the idea is that the labels applied pressure, because if Spotify is directly to sign and promote artists, and record labels become obsolete except for the rights that they already own. So this is what people believe. So yeah, this is what part of the reason that power and having, an oligopoly with the labels is really significant. I feel like there was another part of your question that I was going to answer, and I don't remember what that part was. But yeah, they're constrained on their ability. I also want to say, too, Spotify is kind of interesting. They aren't necessarily people who love music, right? It's a tech firm that saw an opening. Yeah, and they were able to help revitalize the industry. The industry was really in a bad place in the early 2000s. We had Napster. There was a lot of piracy. A lot of people said that Steve Jobs kind of came in as a savior, but many would say that actually Steve Jobs helped kind of, I don't want to say destroy, but, we went from buying albums to buying 99-cent songs. And we still have, it's still a song economy. The difference is now that we have all of this data. So people are able to really measure early on what people are listening to, what they're responding to, and back engineer it in a way that we might argue isn't good for creativity or for the listener or for, music innovation.
So that takes us nicely, really, to my final question for this part, because you quietly suggest that this is a rentier economy, a financialized economy. It's dominated by the labels who are extracting value from their back catalogues. But also, we started off by saying, well, this is great for consumers. There's infinite choice and it's dead cheap. But those two things can't coexist indefinitely, can they?
Right. No, I completely agree with you. I mean, who is it good for, right? It's kind of good for, the person who listens to music passively, right? And maybe it's good for the music lover who, really wants to there's a song. I remember, in the day, there'd be a song I wanted to listen to, and how hard it was to find like Murray Head's One Night in Bangkok, right? Because it was really difficult to get the album chess. And so now you can get any song, but it's not good for musicians. It's not good for, finding out necessarily what people around you might be playing, for being a part. I grew up in Seattle during grunge, right? And there was something that was, because music was live, because things were cheaper, that, you could have free time and you could make music and you could be creative, and there could be something local that was totally new, totally innovative, that could be discovered, brought up to the national level, inspiring people. And there could be, someone in Bristol who's listening to it and they're seeing music differently. And now, like, that whole chain is broken, right? We're all kind of listening. We're being fed back to the same songs. Even if you're like, hey, wait a second, I like my Spotify. They know me. They got no, actually, it's we have this idea of differentiation, but the algorithm is pretty consistent. We're being led back to the same songs, and it's not good for creativity, inspiration,
it's the same floating, global, unanchored, kind of economy of late capitalism that we've been talking about throughout.
And if I can jump in, I've written in other work about the ways in which song form itself is being transformed by the playlist, right? So for instance, hooks come much earlier. Key changes are less frequent. So, I mean, effectively what we're talking about is a much sonically sort of flatter form. Genre elements become much more modular and are borrowed across pop subgenres and beyond much more easily. And there's a sort of cultural flattening out, for better or for worse, but certainly sort of formal transformations.
If I look back at music, I almost feel that there's some kind of like a dialectical movement where we have something that's like new, that's punk, and then it becomes kind of this mass market cheese. And then musicians and listeners push back. They want something authentic. That's kind of what music is, right? It's something that our soul feels. It's not something to not just a regular consumable product. But I think that this dialectic is being impacted. And yeah, exactly. I'm thinking I must have read Paul's previous work exactly when I was writing this. Exactly right, that the format of the song itself is changing, right? And part of that, too, is because of the structure of Spotify, right? If you have a song that's 30 seconds or 6 minutes, if you play you don't get anything if it's paid for 30 seconds. You get a full payment if it's paid for 31 seconds. Right. So you don't want to have that long introduction that people might skip over. You want people to be able to hear the voice. That's often how people recognize songs, so that they will listen to it long enough that artist is remunerated. Also, you don't want to have a super long song because you want to have, a shorter song so that you can get more music in. And actually, I do remember now what I was going to say to Paul earlier. Can I go back to that? Please. Remember, I forgot something. So,
of course.
Talk about Spotify trying to sign artists directly, and about how they couldn't do that. But something that Spotify, or that we do see happening on Spotify, is something called like ghost artists. I don't know if you've seen this. So it's not really songs; it's things that are created to get that 31-second play. I was listening to like a relaxation podcast during a bubble bath, and it was all these like 31-second songs. And I realized that the whole playlist was something that was contrived just to redirect funds. And this is a huge problem for the labels. It doesn't mean at all that, I think the labels initially were like, is Spotify doing this deliberately? I don't think they are, but I think they are not doing a good job of keeping those off the platform, which is why, only 70 to 80% of Spotify's revenues goes to the labels and not actually more. It's because a lot of this is being taken by fake music.
And that's a fantastic place to leave things. We've had 2 papers that highlight ways that recording economies shape musical production, both literally and in recording and culturally as a medium, and nod to the transformation of the cultural value of music. Thanks again to our guests, Dr. Paul Rekret and Dr. Betsy Carter, for reminding us that not everyone gets the cake and most of us are left washing the dishes.
That's it. You've been listening to, or maybe watching, Cultural Economy in the Kitchen from the Journal of Cultural Economy's editorial collective. Today's episode was produced by C. Ross Cinematics. You'll find links to the papers at the end of the video if you're watching on YouTube, and if you're participating in music recording economies, we hope you'll join us on Spotify or Apple Music or Amazon Music as well. Don't forget to like and subscribe, tell your friends, and share. Thank you.